The user interface for a web app is designed and developed using web forms, buttons, and any element or action that can be detected or modified by JavaScript. This next tutorial reviews some of the web form elements available in HTML5. On the left, I've got the HTML5 code for the document, and on the right, the display in the browser. Initially, I'm going to use the browser Firefox. In this first part, we're not using any CSS to provide styling, so that we see the default appearance of each of the form elements. We'll start with text input. We can either use a single line or a larger text area. Our form starts with a method, an action. In this case, we're simply sending it to a reflector, and the reflector will return to us any data that we submit to the server. It's good practice always to give the form an ID, a name, and it is also good practice to give each form element a label. The label needs to match the ID of the form element itself. So, label for my text 1, and I've used a name of my text 1 and an ID of my text 1. This is the first form element here in the browser, and you can see that initially there's this grey text, type a line of text. This is produced by the placeholder. So here we have placeholder equal to text, type a line of text. I can set the required length for a text element. So here we've set a max length of 20 and a min length of 10. If I try and submit the form with a value outside that, then it will give me a warning message and the form will not be submitted. And initially there is no content. The value contains no text. Using a label means that if I click on the type a line of text here, it gives focus to the form element. And also if I tab through the form, it'll give focus to the element. So here's type a line of text. If I click on that, you can see that focus is now in the form element. So this improves both the accessibility and the usability of the form. If I type in some text and it is below the quantity required, I will get a message. If I increase the amount of text, it will submit. This type of action is not usually what we want when we are using a web app, but for the basic design of a form, this is quite satisfactory. We've replaced our form page with the reply from the server. When we're working with web apps, we often don't want our own page to change, and for this we will use different techniques. The second example of a text input contains text that is pre-inserted into the form element. We might use this if we were editing some data from a database. we insert this into the value. So here is the line of text that is pre-inserted. This is content pre-inserted into the input field. And our form here ends with a submit button, and we close the form tag. Not all forms need a submit button. There are other ways of submitting content which we will examine in a later tutorial. If we want a larger amount of text, then we can use a text area, and we can set the size of the text area in rows and columns. We can also use the placeholder text area type of paragraph of text, and this is what appears before the user types anything in. In the second example, we have pre-inserted text into the text area. Again, this is something you would use if you wanted to edit text that already exists. Notice it is not placed within a value if you're using a text area. We have a starting tag for the text area and a closing tag for a text area. Again, we have a name and an ID. I usually give them the same value. My text area 2, and this is matched by the label for my text area 2. And again, clicking on the label gives focus to the text element. The password element is very similar to a text input element, except that what you type in is hidden. Again, we start with a label that matches the name and ID of my pass here. We can also set a minimum length. We could set a maximum length as well if that was needed. And a submit button, so that if I submit, we've set the maximum length of 12, we should now get a message to say that this isn't long enough. And you can see the message disappearing there when we get to the right length. Firefox is recognizing this as a password, and we've got the feedback from the server. Our next element has a type of number, and this is used if you want an integer number. You can set a minimum value and a maximum value for this number, and the user is able to select a number by clicking through the sequence. And although I can continue clicking, it won't move any further than the values that I have set. The user can also type in a number, but that now has given me a warning that this is outside the limits of the values that have been set. Please select a value that is no more than 10. And there's our value of 10 submitted to the server. Sometimes we want to make it easy for the user to select a number, and this is a slider. It may not be particularly important what the number is, as it is a number on a scale. And you can see that there's no feedback in Firefox as to the number that I've actually selected here. I'd selected a number of 6. This has an input type called range. Again, I'm using a minimum and maximum to set the values, and an initial value of 0 and a step of 1. When we come on to CSS, we will realize that styling a slider can be quite complicated. The next group of elements are used to make choices from pre-configured lists. We'll start with the drop-down list. Clicking on the list provides alternatives we can select. The element is called a select element. The group is given a name and an ID. Each of the choices is given a value, but in the case of the first item, choose a flower, I'm not providing a value. Then each of the other options is given a value that meaningfully corresponds to the label that identifies it. And we have a submit button. Radio inputs allow us to select one of a group. Clicking on a different one automatically removes the earlier choice. The input type is radio. Each item has the same name because this belongs to the radio group named color, and its individual ID for each of the choices. So we've got red, blue and green. The values red, blue and green. And labels for each of them as well, so that if we click on the label, then it will automatically select that radio element. This can make it much more usable to click on radio elements if they're quite small, and particularly useful if it is a touch screen. The next is a checkbox, and again we've got labels that allow us to select an item to be checked. The difference with a checkbox is that we can check more than one element. The name of each is the same in that selected group, and notice that we've got these square brackets following the name. This is because we're using PHP, and we need to indicate to PHP that this is going to be an array. And this allows us to separate out the values of each ID on the server. So again, they've all got the same name because they're all part of the same input type checkbox, but they've each got their own separate ID. So we've got an ID of apple, a value of apple, and initially apple is checked. So we've pre-checked that element. The others are not pre-checked. If we're editing or confirming an item that uses a checkbox, we can pre-check the items that have been saved to the server, so that information is then retained. So there we have a checkbox, and the reflector here is telling us that this is an array, and we've got the value of apple, banana and grape in our array. When you have a drop-down list, you want to be able to use multiple items, not just the single item that we had before. Again, if you're using PHP, you need to use an array, and again it is a select, and we've got the options here: daisy, tulip, dahlia and rose. And you can see that these are displayed here in a slightly different way to the simple drop down that we had before. Many users are not familiar with how to select from multiple choices like this, so you might need to indicate to them how you go about selecting multiple items from a list. And again, on the server, we can see that this array has been detected. The array is called mflower, and we've got the values of daisy, tulip and dahlia submitted. Date and time inputs are one of the more recent developments of HTML5, and when I was initially looking at what was available early in 2017, the main browsers were not really agreeing with each other as to how to display this information. The main browsers are now displaying date and time, but many Microsoft browsers are not. The date element, I click, provides me with a choice of dates that I can click through and insert into the form element. And I can see the format of the date on the server with a dash between the date, the month and the day. So here we see the input type is date. I've used a name and an ID of my date, and I've set a maximum and minimum value for the dates. I've also set a placeholder here, but the placeholder is not actually valid for the date element, but the browsers seem to implement it in the same way as other elements. Let us try a date outside the range that's been selected. So we've got 2020 12/31. Let's see if we can it allows us to view. And let's see if it will submit. So it's only when we come to submit that date that it warns us that it is outside the range that's been selected. The next input type is datetime local. So this includes a date and time. And again, you can see that my placeholder is being displayed even though it is not a valid part of HTML5. you can type in, and as it shows you here, year, month, day, hours and minutes are what has been set. If I click on that element, nothing happens. So this is in Firefox, and we haven't got the datetime local implemented. I would need to type in my date at this point. If I look at Chrome-based, I can select the date in a datetime local, and I can select the numbers for hours, minutes and seconds. And I've also got AM, PM, so I can submit that, and there we get the format of the date and time submitted to the server. So we can again see we've got a dash between the year, the month and the day, a T that then separates that from the time, 2057, with a colon separating those two values. So we don't have the same appearance of the web browser when we're using this. Is a Chrome-based browser, and it's not the same as Firefox. Again, while we're in our Chrome-based browser, here is a time input. So the input type is time. The drop-down arrows are appearing when I click on there, and I can cycle through the hours. I need to click on the minutes, and then I can adjust the minutes, and I've got AM and PM available again, which I can submit. So 6:42 PM, and I've got limit set. A max of 1700, a min of 9 o'clock. So maybe for the working day between 9 AM and 5 PM. So that is outside those limits. So again, let's change that. And again, the warning disappears at that point. 1642. We can see that the value is separated here by the colon. It's still perfectly valid to select a time and date by individual sequences. Here we're using input type of number for each of these. For the year, we're setting a minimum of 2017, a maximum of 2020. For the month, between 1 and 12. For the day, between 1 and 31. And then hours between 0 and 23. Minutes between 0 and 59. This works fine, except that it's possible on that sequence to select dates that don't exist, like the 31st of February. So if you use a method like that, you would then need to use JavaScript to ensure that dates are valid, and remember leap years as well. But this does work across all browsers. It's also quite intuitive to use. At the moment, if you're going to use a date picker, it might be better to use jQuery date picker or similar, as this again tends to work across most browsers. It is more difficult to set limits, but you do have a wider variety of formats for selecting your dates. The color picker element can be very useful, particularly if you want users to be able to select the color scheme for a web app. However, there is a big difference in the appearance of the color picker between Firefox and Chrome-based browsers. In Firefox, if I click on the color picker element, I get this screen and I can select the main color and the shades. I can see the value here, or as red, green, blue, or as hue saturation values. And this is the value that will be submitted to the server. So I can select that particular color and then submit. And here is the submitted value. In a Chrome-based browser, again, I can click on the element, but what I see from my color chooser is a completely different design, with a color bar on the side, the selected color at the bottom, and the hex code of the color to the side. So again, I can select a color, I can select the shades of that color, and submit to the server. And there again, the hex code has been submitted to the server. So the input type is color, ID of my color, and the initial value for the color to be displayed, and that provides an excellent color picker. There is also an input type of email, which does some quite basic validation of the pattern of text that is input for an email. This is no real test of an email. The only effective way of using email validation is to send a message to the user, to their email address that they've submitted, asking them to click on an encrypted link which confirms that the email does exist and is in the control of the user who is registered. The final form element in this sequence is the hidden element. We frequently use this if we want to include data in a form, but we don't want the user to modify that data. But always remember that it is possible for the user to make changes to hidden data and to submit a form with these changes. So always validate your hidden data on the server, just in case that has happened. I've also given this a name, an ID, and the value of the hidden data is here. So here it is a string of text. Hidden values are not visible to the user, but they can always inspect them in the code. And if we submit the hidden data, here it is displayed back by the server. The form elements that we've used so far have been part of a form that submits to the server and refreshes the whole browser window. However, web apps often require us to keep the same design on the screen, and what we have here is an example of a much more complex web app. It's got some use of forms for submitting a date, but the main input here, doesn't use forms at all. It uses just the ordinary HTML division that has been made editable, and this is using JavaScript called CK Editor, which allows the full content to be edited in full HTML, so all HTML elements can be inserted in. If I test this content, and this input, I can use options to change the background color, foreground color, turn it into a list, and so on. Now, this is automatically saved without needing to refresh the page, simply by moving elsewhere. At the moment, we can see this box tells us that this is being edited. As soon as I click away, this item has been saved, and it's giving me the details of the items that's been saved in a form. I could now edit the code if I wished and update that using a form. But again, if I make a change and I update, that is a web form, but it's not refreshing the whole page, but JavaScript is refreshing this item in the data. So that is now saved on the database. The web app has updated the screen, but not the whole page. And this is the type of behavior we often want in a web app. But this is somewhat more complex and will be the subject of a later tutorial.